One of the underlying themes of my work, and really a major preoccupation, has been trying to understand the poetics of illness and healing. And by that I mean the ways in which language and imagery and symbol constitute our experience and allow for possibilities of transformation. And my motivations for this being preoccupied with this, come from several strands. I should say perhaps the most basic one is my own connections to poetry and to language, and going back again to childhood, a very vivid sense of the power of words, of the magic of words, if you will, the evocative power of words, a fascination with literature, with novels, with poetry in particular, with lyric poetry. So that is coming from a partly an aesthetic sense and an emotional sense of connection to language. And one thing that the poet would probably say is that the basic idea from Saussure, that the connection of words to objects is arbitrary in some ways, is something that most poets would reject from the beginning. That most poets would say it's not just that we have a symbol system and we line it up with things. Words come out of the world. They come out of bodily experience. They come out of, they're grounded in some ways, in very vivid ways. So that set of experiences, really personal experiences, my own efforts to write poetry and to experience that, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, have been an undercurrent. And for a signal moment for me came when I was in training in California, and I had a chance to go to the first conference on cognitive science held in San Diego, in La Jolla, actually. And I heard George Lakoff talk there. Actually, I was in a room next to George Lakoff in the little student residence we were staying. I heard John Searle. I heard a lot of Anthony Ortoni, a lot of amazing people whose writing was very important to me later. But Lakoff in particular, as someone who had trained with Noam Chomsky, but who developed a very different approach to linguistics that was centered on meaning, and in particular centered on the idea of metaphor as the vehicle or the main pivot of meaning. And so, as you know, Lakoff and Johnson wrote this book called Metaphors We Live By, and for me that book was a kind of revelation. It resonated very deeply with my own sense of what goes on in language. The idea that we're always speaking in metaphors, that those metaphors are evocative of things, that they draw from us images and associations, and that's how we're operating, and that technical language narrows down the scope of metaphor. It gives us rules for using certain metaphors, so then we become more precise and we develop this scientific language. But those evocative and resonant words are always present. So I became very interested in using that body of work, which grew from Lakoff to a large body of work in cognitive science that is partly empirical, that looks at actually what happens in metaphor processing and how do people generate metaphors, how does encountering metaphors affect people's thinking and even affect their physiology. On the one hand, and then a kind of exegetical work on metaphor that was done by Paul Ricoeur, done by Hans Blumenberg, done by many scholars who've tried to unpack the meanings and the associations of metaphor in different ways. So there's several traditions like this that Blumenberg wrote about metaphorology. Ricoeur wrote about, in English, the rule of metaphor. So these are major works by philosophers, hermeneutic and other continental philosophers, who are trying to understand how does meaning get elaborated? What is it that human beings do with language, essentially? And metaphor is right at the center of that. So metaphor for me is a bridge between this intuition or this experience of the power of language, the immediacy of language in some ways, and a more elaborate understanding of where that language comes from. And the ideas really that have been elaborated more recently, both through this metaphor work and through other work in cognitive science, argue that metaphor has a double origin. Part of it is embodied experience, and this is part of the story in Metaphors We Live By, and later work by Lakoff and Johnson that argues that children begin learning language through being in a social environment in which they are doing things, and they're being that's being narrated in a way. So you put something in, you're learning the meaning of in. You take something out, you're learning the meaning of out. You see a lemon, you're learning the meaning of lemon. And this is what Lawrence Barsalou calls grounded cognition, that the building blocks of cognition are actual sensory and motor experiences. And those give rise to the first metaphors that we have, that we then use to generate more and more abstract knowledge, kind of scaffolding. And the implication of that, first of all, it gives us a reasonable story, a developmental story of how we could start simple and get more complex. But it also implies that even in our complex language, that simple story, those simple origins may still be present and may have resonances or have implications in language. And so over the years, I've written a series of papers about metaphor and experience that try to do that. An early paper was called The Body's Insistence on Meaning, and this is actually a paper that was developed originally for that conference in Zagreb that I mentioned, where I was invited to come and talk and be among people who had done a lot of work on hermeneutics. And so it was an attempt, and it's built around a clinical case. I was working as a consultant in dialysis unit. So it's built around the clinical case of a man who doesn't want to have a transfusion because he's convinced that if he gets a transfusion, the blood will contain DNA, and the DNA will contain the personality of the person who gave it, and he will be infected by the personality of that person. What I don't say in that paper, which I think is still worth recounting that other layer, is part of his concern was that that blood will come from a local person, and he's a person from somewhere else, and he has this negative racist attitude about local people. So it's another layer that was very messy to deal with, because how do you deal with somebody who's saying things that are not only idiosyncratic but offensive to you? How do you negotiate that? But the point of the paper then was to take the story of this man who's now I've been asked to see him as a psychiatrist because his nephrologist is worried that he won't accept a transfusion, but his hemoglobin is getting very low and he needs a transfusion. And I'm supposed to decide, is he mentally competent? And so, yeah, he's perfectly mentally competent. He's a reasonable guy, but he has these interesting beliefs that are not the same beliefs I have, or not the same beliefs his doctor has. So what are we dealing with there? Because from his doctor's point of view, there's one rational thing to do. If I tell you you need a transfusion or you're going to die, you should just accept this transfusion. If you say, but I think this transfusion is a foreign substance coming into my body and it has all these unpleasant meanings to me, how do I deal with that? Is that just irrationality? Or is that actually how we all think all the time anyway? And we contain it or we manage it in different ways. So that's essentially what the paper argues, that medicine has this rationalistic view of how people are thinking. In fact, people are thinking through metaphors that are emotionally charged, sensorily evocative and emotionally charged, and they're making decisions largely on that basis, sometimes constrained by logical, rational things that they've been told they should follow. But that's and what's interesting about that account is then it implies a kind of irrationality and even non-consciousness that is not the Freudian non-conscious. It can intersect with that. Gleim had his own reasons for feeling vulnerable and fearful that would fit a more psychodynamic account. But this part that we're talking about now is about the unconscious of language, about what's sedimented in language, what's sedimented in imagery, what's sedimented in the metaphors that we use. So for me, that was very important because it suggests there's lots of other stuff going on that is not conscious, but that is part of culture. It's part of the water we're swimming in. And it's not because you repressed it. It's because the whole point of culture is you don't have to think about it. You just use it. If you had to think about it all the time, you'd never get anything done. So there are lots of things that are not conscious, not because we're defending against them, but because it's important that most things be non-conscious, or we'll waste the limited bandwidth we have for consciousness in dealing with the most basic details. At the same time, those things that are non-conscious, that have been sedimented, the fact that I call the edge of this bottle a lip, right? This is, in English, this is the lip of the bottle. it's the lip of the bottle, because I'm using human anatomy to name things, just like the Inuit name all the parts of the ilu are named after the body, right? So this is natural. People do this all the time. But this is what we would call a dead metaphor, right? When I say the lip of the bottle, you don't think, oh, he's talking about his lip. You think, oh, that's the name for that part of the thing. But if Walt Disney comes along and suddenly makes the tip of this bottle start talking, we know right away what's happening, and we know why that's funny, or why that's natural in some ways to begin to do that. So the point is, we're using dead metaphors all the time. Practically everything we're using is a dead metaphor of some kind. They can be brought to life very easily, and you can even show that some of them are operating, some of the connotations are operating subliminally all the time. So that's the embodied part of the metaphor. The other part is the discursive part, the narrative part. So we build these metaphors up developmentally from the body, but something is also happening from the top down. While the child is experiencing these things, the mother or other people around them, the father, are narrating what's going on. So you're also getting a story within which your body is located. We are linguistic beings. There's a new book by Ezekiel DePaulo and his colleagues on linguistic bodies. So we are linguistic bodies, that we are in this interplay. So my interest has been to take this, essentially, I would say, poetic intuition about the power of language and try to connect it to all this interesting work on cognition, empirical work on how people think, and use that to develop a kind of model both of what happens in illness experience, like where does a symptom come from, what is it really involving. It's not just something that's given by the phenomenology of the body, by the neural structure of the body, let's say, but it's also penetrated by language from the very beginning. And what happens in healing, where we offer people a different metaphor or a different story, and they then are able to move. They're able to move their thinking, their self-representation, but even they're able to transform their body in some ways. So this is an unfinished book, I have to say, which I'm going to go on record now by saying I will get this done very shortly, because I've been working on this book for 30 years, because I've written a series of papers that were imagined as chapters in that book, but have never been woven together, that include that paper I mentioned, of Body's Insistence on Meaning, include a paper called Healing in the Invention of Metaphor, a paper called Broken Narrative. So there's a whole series of papers that talk about this idea of metaphor as the fulcrum, or the pivot, or the mediator between our bodies and the discourses that make up the social world. And what's interesting to me about this is not only does it allow us then to use all these resources and to listen to things and hear things in a different way, that it gets us much closer to what people are actually experiencing, but it gives us tools for critique. We can ask what happens in medicine when we talk about a treatment as a weapon, or saying we're fighting a disease. What is the positive consequence and what is the unintended consequence? Because that word has all kinds of connotations. Once you a metaphor, as Ricoeur said, a metaphor is a narrative in miniature. Because once you put the fight metaphor out, it starts spreading into a whole story now. Right now, there's two sides to a war, and there's artillery, and there's war crimes, and there's all kinds of things that can go on that are extensions of the metaphor. And as I say, we may or may not want those extensions. We might want to use a metaphor in a very specific way, but what comes along with it is a lot of other stuff, and it becomes a problem. And in the book and in some of the papers I've written, I give examples of where a doctor uses a word that he's treating it as literal, because in his own mind he just means it this way. And the patient is hearing it, since they don't have that same frame, they're taking it now as a metaphor that they extend in very different directions, sometimes very troublesome consequences for people. So for me, this is, and there are many anthropologists. I mean, I think of is it John Fernandez? I mean, there are many Paul Friedrich, many anthropologists who've written about this, both before and after Lakoff in different ways. And for me, what's interesting is I can make use of a lot of that, including a lot of the philosophical work, but connect it to this very empirical work that actually shows, I mean, there's a whole body of work from John Barr and others, Raymond Gibbs, showing that, for example, Ray Gibbs has this little study where you're given a piece of paper with blanks in it, with sentences that you have to fill in the blank, and there are different possible ways you could fill in the blank, many sentences. If you're standing, compared to when you're sitting, if you're standing, you'll fill in words that are related to balance. Whereas if you're sitting, you won't. And that's completely subliminal, non-conscious. You're not aware of it. That's not what the sentences are exactly about. But it's a consequence of the fact that when you're standing, you're balancing all the time. You have to make constant little adjustments to stay standing. So it's an example of embodiment, of the phenomenology of embodiment, and how our bodily experience is shaping our cognition. If I lie down, if I sit, if I stand, my thinking is going to be slightly different because of the phenomenology. So this is very interesting to me, again, is, back to where we began with somatics and psychosomatics and so on, because this says, here's something about the psychosomatics and the sociosomatics of language. And the idea that language itself is coming from the body and reconnecting us to the body in different ways. That's one half. I'd say the other half is language is also about rhetoric. Language is about moving other people. Do we talk in ways that make people think, make people imagine what we're saying, make people think what we're saying? And that's basic to human beings. I mean, if I say to you, if you're eating some soup, I had this experience up north years ago with an Inuit colleague, eating soup, and I say, if you pay very close attention, you'll notice the soup is very salty. 60-70% of people are going to take the next spoon and say, oh my God, yes, it's very salty. This is just suggestibility, right? Which is a rapid way for us to influence each other, which is a good thing under most circumstances, because if somebody says, quick, you got to get out of here, or pay attention to this, you don't want to spend a lot of time saying, I don't know, I don't think I should pay attention to you. If it's the people you trust, you should just go with it and see where it takes you. And that's what we do when we listen to a story, right? If my grandfather tells me a story, I don't think, oh, was he saying this, was he saying that? I go, as a child, I go with the story, and I'm there, and I'm in that thing, and so on. So anyway, the idea in all this work is to show the centrality of language, of poesis, of fashioning with language, both in what's constitutive of experience in general, but illness experience in particular, of how it can be transformed, and then to apply the critical tools that gives us to thinking about the language of healing, the language of the self, the language of trauma, and so on. So it works both ways. It's say, what's going on here, and why do we construe it a certain way, which is always a partial version, because that's one of the other insights of metaphor, is any given metaphor is a piece of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. The reality is larger than any metaphor we have. So every metaphor we choose reveals some things and hides others. So again, what are the consequences? So that's why I hope you're hearing in what I'm saying, why this fascination with language, with metaphor, as a way into thinking about culture and thinking about the cultural shaping of bodily experience, of illness and of healing, is sort of central to my thinking and to all the work that I've done in some ways. And this is the unfinished project to put all this together in a way, which I hope I've sort of summarized now, in a way that I think, with a lot of specific examples in different domains, is sort of this unfinished work that has appeared in many pieces of it, appeared in different papers and so on, but soon to come in a book, which I hope will be